Welcome, everyone. As Acting Dean of the Southern Illinois University School of Law, I welcome you to the 2018 John and Marsha Ryan Bioethicist-in-Residence public lecture. Tonight's lecture is also featured as part of SIU Women's History Month activities and as part of SIU's system-wide Diversity Week. This lectureship has been an ongoing part of SIU's health law program since 2006. Mr. John and Dr. Marsha Ryan endowed the stellar program to bring in prominent legal and medical ethics scholars to share their research with the SIU School of Law, the SIU School of Medicine, and the Southern Illinois Healthcare Joint Bioethics Committees. Please join me in thanking the Ryans for their benevolent support. Thank you again, John and Marsha. In addition, I'd like to take a moment to recognize some special guests who are with us this evening. We have our Acting Associate Dean, Cindy Bice, here. We can welcome her. Emeritus Professor Gene DeSanta, the founder of our health law program. We have Athletic Director Tommy Bell this time. We have SIH Legal Counsel Bill Sherwood here. And we also have the Interim Associate Chancellor for Diversity, Todd Bryson. In addition, welcome as well to our audience at the SIU School of Medicine in Springfield. They are joining us via simulcast this evening. The 2018 Ryan Bioethicist-in-Residence is Alice Dreger, a medical historian, sex researcher, writer, and patient advocate. An award-winning scholar, Dr. Dreger's latest major work is Galileo's Middle Finger, Heretics, Activists, and the Search for Justice in Science, which argues that the pursuit of evidence is the most important ethical imperative of our time. Dr. Dreger earned her PhD in History and Philosophy of Science from Indiana University. She has served as a writer for the health sections of the Atlantic and Pacific Standard and for the blog of Psychology Today. Her op-eds have been featured in numerous other publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, Wired, Slate, the LA Times, The Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, and New Statesman. In addition, she has appeared as a guest expert on programs including Oprah, Savage Love, Good Morning America, and NPR, as well as on various documentaries. Besides functioning as a historian and writer, Dr. Dreger has served as a patient advocate and consultant to pediatric specialists undertaking clinical reform, particularly in the treatment of children born with norm-challenging body types, including intersex, conjoined twinning, facial anomalies, and short stature. Former chair of the Intersex Society of North America, she also served as an ethics consultant to an NIH-funded translational research network on pediatric intersex care and co-edited a medical education guide on LGBT and differences of sex development for the Association of American Medical Colleges. Furthermore, she has consulted with the International Olympic Committee's Medical Commission on sex and gender divisions in sports in light of developmental biology, fairness, and social justice. This evening, Dr. Dreger will present on who should count as a woman on a playing field, the question of intersex and trans in sports. Please help me welcome Dr. Alice Dreger.
when it comes to gender is because it turns out biology does matter to some extent. And that's one of the reasons we have divisions. So if we think about the issue of gender, then we the term that we're using there, what we mean by that is the biological aspects of human life or animal life. And that includes things like our chromosomes. And gender. The challenges to sport occur with intersex and with transgender. And what intersex means is the most basic level of definition, is when you have biological types that are between the male and the female. And I'll give you some examples in a little bit about the types of intersex, for example, that you could have a child raised as a girl who is a woman, but she has intersex biology. In terms of transgender, what we're talking about there is people whose gender identities are different from those that they were assigned at birth. So some intersex people are transgender. That means they're biologically in between and they have rejected the gender assigned given to them at birth. Some transgender people have underlying intersex biology, but they're not the same. They're overlapping, but they're not the same categories. And we're at the point, increasingly, at least in American culture, where we recognize that we don't have to think about intersex as pathological, and we don't have to think about transgender as abnormal. That in fact, these are actually fairly common once you begin to recognize people in the population. So what's really interesting as I was reading up the latest statistics, the IOC tells us that women who are what they call hyperandrogenized, that means women who have higher levels of testosterone and other androgens, so closer to the male typical level of sex hormones, they're actually really common among elite athletes at the Olympic level. So when they actually do sort of random screening, what they find is 7.1 out of 1,000 elite female athletes has hyperandrogenism. In other words, could count as intersex, if that's your definition of intersex in that population. In the general population, they estimate it's 1 in 20,000. So it's far more common among the elite female athlete population. Transgender, on the other hand, so far there have been no transgender people who competed in the Olympics. And that's not because they've been entirely banned. They actually haven't been, although the standards have been unreasonable until recently. But it is the case that there have been none when we know there are lots of transgender people. So intersex is actually overrepresented in the Olympic population, at least among women. And transgender is very underrepresented. And again, that has some to do with the regulations, but it probably also has to do with biology. So if we look at the challenges to sports again, looking at challenges of intersex and transgender, I gave you just two pictures there. One is Marie-José Patino, who's was an elite Olympic athlete. I'll tell you about her story. She's also now advising the IOC and the IAA. The other picture I gave you is Renee Richards, who was one of the first elite athletes to transition and play as a woman. And ran into a lot of hostility as a result. But with transgender, I want to bring you actually a more recent story, which is the story of Tiffany Ambrose. You may have seen this in the New York Times, actually just this week. I thought it was great to have the story happened to come out this week, so it's a useful one to think about. Tiffany is a transgendered woman, so she was born biologically male and is now transitioned to become a woman biologically. Obviously, you can't transition completely biologically, but you can do hormonal interventions, you can do surgical interventions. The IOC no longer requires surgical interventions, they only require hormonal transition today. But she is a volleyball player in Brazil, and she's hoping to make the Olympic team for Brazil. And the New York Times piece on her was really interesting because it did not tell the story we would have read 10 years ago, which was a story of great hostility. This was a story actually of her having a big fan base who actually really admires her for her journey. And the people who were criticizing her and saying she shouldn't be allowed to play were not saying what we would have heard 10 years ago, which is, she's really a man, this guy's really a man. What they were saying was, we recognize she's a woman, but she has an unfair advantage. So the dialogue about this has really shifted in the last 10 years, and I think in a very productive way. So when we're talking about transgender, again, we're talking about people whose gender identities are different from those assigned at birth. So these are people who were assigned one gender at birth, but when they grew, they decided that was the wrong identification for themselves. And so what's the concern in terms of sports? Well, the concern in part is that there's a belief that there may be an advantage of the remaining male biology. So again, you can't transition everything over. You can't transition your sex hormones over, for example. You can't change some of the way your body has already grown if you've gone through the typical male puberty. So there may be bone differences, there may be muscular differences, there may be muscle memory differences. The other issue is this issue of the assumed advantage of a male typical biological history, and then also an assumed advantage of a male social history. So when boys train in sports, they are often trained in a different way than girls are trained. They're trained more intensely, frankly, in many cases. And so one concern is, if you did grow up playing a sport identified as a boy, is it possible that you're going to have an advantage from social history? This is kind of a funny argument because what you get to do depends entirely on where you're born and how you're identified. And gender is actually just one part of that, but that is part of the concern when you have people playing who were born as boys but are now women. So the history of this has been a history of great hostility historically, although that's been changing. And the hostility has been especially sharp towards male to female athletes. And that's been true actually in general in terms of hostility towards transgender people. And that's probably because of the fact that the female is considered in many social cultural systems historically to be lower than the male. So to have somebody transition from a male to a female is kind of a challenge to that system because they're accepting a role that is lower. It doesn't make sense in the system. So there's a lot of latent homophobia and a lot of latent gender hostility, historically speaking. But as I've mentioned, there is a history now of increasing inclusion. So a lot of organizations, including sports organizations, are trying to figure out how to be inclusive of people who are transgender. And that's radically changed in the last 10 years. If I was giving this talk 10 years ago, I would have to convince you to think about this. Many of you now just accept that this is part of the way sports is going, and how do we think about it? So there have been a ton of discussions and rules on how to deal with this. Originally, the IOC had a policy called the Stockholm Consensus, and actually until quite recently, they only changed it quite recently. It was a very problematic policy, and it was one of the things I criticized when I met with the IOC. It said, for example, that you had to have genital surgery in order to play as a woman or as a man in terms of a transgender athlete. And one of the things I asked them is, do you think there's an advantage or a disadvantage to having a penis when you're playing? I really don't think there is. So why do you need to have surgery on your genitals to play? It was an open question. And they recognized that, and they've gotten rid of the surgical requirement. The other challenge is that they required particular kinds of legal and social identification, which in some nations you simply can't get. So there are some nations in which you can't be identified in the way you might want to be identified that they were requiring. So they've loosened the rules on that. The current IOC rules on transgender look like this. They say very plainly that those who transition from female to male are eligible to compete in the male category without restriction. And the reason is because the IOC believes that testosterone is actually a male hormone. That's how they will tell you the truth, that women produce it, all women produce it. But they assume that it really is the rule that makes the male. And so the idea is that you're transitioning from female to male, no harm, no foul, because you're coming into a category where you'll boost your testosterone using permission. and that's allowed. But there are very strict rules for transitioning from male to female, and the reason is because of the perceived advantages that I think are well documented that males have biologically, especially in track and sport. Those are two areas where we see a significant advantage. And there the rules now say that you have to have a declared female gender identity, and it can't be changed for sporting purposes for 4 years. And I'm not exactly sure what sporting purposes mean, but it cracks me up because it makes it sound like you change your gender for sport, right? But I think what it means is that you have to, if you're going to be playing as an athlete, you have to have a stable gender identity as a female, identified as such for 4 years. It doesn't say, oh, you have to have it 4 years prior to competition. It just appears to me that you can't play as a woman and then switch and play as a man again shortly thereafter, or vice versa. You have to demonstrate a total testosterone level in serum, in other words, in your blood, that's been below 10 nanomoles per liter for at least 12 months prior to the first competition. This would be a high level for a typical female, but athletes who are women often have higher levels of T. It's a low level for a typical male. And so the belief is they've done a bunch of studies, done a bunch of scatter charts, and decided this is a reasonable cutoff because most males would be well above this and most females would not be too far below this. You have to remain below that level during your eligibility period, and they can be monitored by testing. So in other words, they can sort of randomly test you to make sure that your hormone levels are low enough. How do you get your hormone levels that low? Typically, somebody who's transitioning for purposes like this would get what's called morchiectomy, which means you have your testicles removed, and you would take hormone replacement therapy that would be more closely aligned to the female typical. So you'd be taking mostly estrogen and progesterone and not taking testosterone. And so that would dramatically drop your testosterone level. As I mentioned, males and females both make androgens. Androgens is the general term for the hormones that include testosterone. We females actually make it from our ovaries, but we also have glands in the back of our bodies, as do males, called adrenal glands. And adrenal glands help keep us healthy in terms of our endocrine system. And those produce testosterone. So females will produce the same hormones that males actually produce. The difference between males and females hormonally is a concentration level. So I think of it as a cocktail, and it's as if you're changing what goes into the cocktail. But we make the same hormones. So the idea that testosterone is a male hormone is really kind of it's a social construction. The fact is the levels are higher in terms of males, and it does give them, I believe, advantages in terms of track and sport. But that said, females do make it. It's not like we stole it from men. We make it ourselves. So in terms of the challenges to sport, thinking about intersex, you've got sex very complicated. So when I was growing up, I was led to believe there are two sexes in the world, right? And males and females, and that they matched to men and women. And it was actually only when I was in graduate school that I discovered intersex. And the reason I discovered it was because my dissertation director knew that I was interested in gender and science. And he said, well, you should look at the history of hermaphroditism. And I thought I would look at Darwin's barnacles, and I would look at the history of embryology. And he said, no, look at medicine. And I thought, why would I look at medicine? This doesn't happen in humans past the embryonic stage. And I realized when I started looking at medicine that I was completely wrong. This was the mid-1990s, and intersex was still very hidden socially. In fact, when you go to the medical literature, it's all over the medical literature. But we had not been told about this in popular culture, in sex ed class, nowhere were we told about it. In fact, when I published my first book at Harvard, which is a book called Hermaphrodites and the Medical Invention of Sex, my mother started reading it, and she called me and she said, do you remember John so-and-so who you grew up with? And I said, yes. And she said, well, when he was born, they didn't know what sex he was. And I said to my mother, well, tell me where he is, because there's support groups now for people like him. And she said, oh, no, we never told him. Which is exactly what I documented in the book, which is there is this enormous medical secrecy around intersex, even to the extent of lying to patients about their medical histories and not telling them about their own medical histories. Sex normalizing them using surgeries and hormones, and then lying to them about their medical histories. So the truth is that intersex is out there, and it's actually because sex is incredibly complicated. And I don't have time to take you through the whole biology of sex, but I'm going to just walk you through some of the conditions that can lead a girl or a woman to be sex atypical. So this would be children born, identified as girls, and then it turns out they have something more complicated. One is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And that's where those adrenal glands in the back of the body are kind of in high gear, and they're putting out much higher levels of androgens than is typical for a girl, or even typical for a boy. But in terms of fetal development, if you have a genetic female, and there's lots of this going on, the genitals and the rest of the body will skew towards the male pathway. And as a consequence, when these children are born, they can be anything from looking pretty typical female to looking really typical male. In fact, they'll be assumed to be boys unless you do a test and discover that inside they have ovaries and uterus. So congenital adrenal hyperplasia can really skew sex development in terms of the whole spectrum. Then there's a condition called 5-alpha reductase deficiency. You know about this one if you've read the book Middlesex, because in that novel, the main character has this condition. And this is a condition where you have a genetic male, and so in fetal development, there's lots of androgens, testosterone being put out by the testes. But there's a hormone missing that converts the testosterone into the type that causes male genital development. Because the enzyme, there's an enzyme missing, which is 5-alpha reductase. The enzyme is missing. You don't get the conversion to testosterone. So you have a male who is internally male, but genitally they develop much more phenotypical. So when they're born, they look like girls. There's an assumption, okay, this is a girl, we're going to raise her as a girl. But then when the child hits puberty, the testes go into high gear, there's lots of testosterone. Now you don't need the 5-alpha reductase to have the development change. And so they undergo a male typical puberty. So the clitoris will grow to look more like a penis. You have male typical body hair development, male typical muscular development, the voice drops like a male, you get facial hair. So you have somebody who, historically speaking, when we look backwards in the historical records, these people are described as girls into men. So they develop very differently in terms of their puberty. So you can have this kind of condition where a child has been raised with everybody assuming she's typically female, but in fact she's got much more complicated biology. You can have a condition called androgen insensitivity syndrome, and this is the one that Maria Jose Coutinho had, the hurdler, and I'm talking about her history. Androgen insensitivity syndrome is really interesting. So you have a genetic male, and so biologically, in fetal development, the testes are putting out lots of testosterone, so you should get male typical development. But they're lacking the receptors for the hormones. So it's almost like the testosterone is yelling, but nobody's hearing it. And so the body, in terms of the genital development, the brain development, the other development will go female typical, even though internally they have testes. So when they hit puberty, they undergo a female puberty for the most part. And the reason is the testes putting out less testosterone, some of it turns into estrogen. Sex is crazy complicated. So they make estrogen on top of the testosterone. The body ignores the testosterone, but it responds to the estrogen. So they get taller, they get rounded breasts, they get rounded hips, their voice doesn't drop in the male typical fashion. They have female facial hair, so no facial hair. But they don't have a period because inside they have testes. So usually at puberty, it's clear she's undergoing a female puberty, but there's no menstruation. So there's a question what's going on. When a doctor puts a speculum into the vagina, he or she will see that there's no cervix, there's no uterus, the vagina just ends. And so for these folks, they've actually been caught in the intersex system of the IOC because they have XY chromosomes. But the irony is they have lower levels of testosterone response than somebody like me, who I think I'm probably a typical female, because I have testosterone being made in my body and I have the receptors. So these women have been thrown out from the female playing field because of having XY chromosomes, even though they have less advantage from testosterone than the typical female. So that's a really complicated one. Then you have genetic mosaicism. Some people have XX in some of their cells, XY in other cells, and this can lead to very complicated biology. You can also have polycystic ovary syndrome, which you have a typical female, but her ovaries have cysts on them that are producing extra hormones. And that can cause more skewed towards a masculinization in terms of body hair, in terms of muscular development. So that's a typical female, but she has higher than normal levels of androgens because of polycystic ovary syndrome. So when you look at all this is why you can have so many women who are elite women athletes turn out to have various kinds of conditions that are considered hyperandrogenism conditions. The only one on here that would not be hyperandrogenism by their definition would be androgen sensitivity syndrome, because even though you have a high level of testosterone, if you lack the receptors, there's no effect. So if we look at the history of what's happened in terms of intersex in sports, what we see is that the concern has been that there's a biological advantage from having male typical aspects. That's the worry. and that historically speaking, what's happened is an exclusion of women who have been found to have any type of atypical sex. So at the elite level, if women have been spotted as having any kind of sex difference, they've often been basically ejected. And as a consequence, there's been an emergence of rules about who can play as a woman in the 20th century. So if we look at the history of this, what we see is that in the 1960s, the Olympic Committee started doing what are called bar body tests. And that's basically where they were just looking at sex chromosomes. They're looking to see if you had a Y chromosome. And if you did, they threw you out. And they were actually issuing these things called certificates of femininity, because there's no joke, to decide who would be allowed to play as a woman. And Patino actually had one of these certificates of femininity because they thought that she would have to pass the bar body test. But then when she was tested again later, they found that in fact she had Y chromosomes, and the reason why she had androgen sensitivity syndrome. Now this is a woman who had grown up as a girl and a woman, right? She had never menstruated, but a lot of elite athletes never menstruate because they have such lean body mass that their menses don't happen. So she wasn't that shocked that she wasn't menstruating because she knew that a lot of the athletic women don't menstruate. And so she was quite shocked when it was announced to her that in fact she had testes and a Y chromosome, and unfortunately it was done rather publicly. Her fiance, if I recall correctly, left her. She became very depressed. And she decided to fight it, which I think was very brave. And what she ultimately did was she fought it and she got the rule eliminated. So she is a very important person in the history of intersex in terms of certainly the treatment of athletes. She now consults with the IOC. Ironically, she supports the hyperandrogenism policy, which to me is funny because the hyperandrogenism policy assumes testosterone is the key to sport. She has no effect from testosterone, but she was a medalist. So surely she should recognize that, in fact, testosterone isn't the be-all and end-all, but she has supported the IOC in terms of the rule. So what happened next in terms of a major history was that Caster Semenya, a South African runner, in 2009 showed up on the scene and started having pretty good scores and had some of her peers accuse her of really being a man. And so that's when the IOC decided to come up with a hyperandrogenism policy and said very specifically in a rule, a new rule, it basically said that if you had high levels of androgens and you had the receptors, then you couldn't play unless you submitted to medical systems that would reduce your androgen level. So the policy basically said this. It limited somewhat who could request an investigation. So it said particular people could request an investigation of athletes, so that not just anybody could. That was partly because of what happened to Semenya. So Semenya, it was an absolutely terrible thing that happened to her. Basically, she was sitting in a hotel room watching television when her name was being mentioned, and she found out that all these medical tests she'd just been going through the last few days were to test for sex. Nobody had told her. That's why she was having all these invasive medical tests. So when they came up with this formal policy, they were trying to make it better in terms of not having athletes thrust upon the stage with no warning that their sex was under investigation. She had never suspected, as far as she knew, that she would be violating this policy. It also indicated that there would be an expert panel with examinations, so specific medical professionals would be assigned to doing these. And there would be a problem if, quote, the investigated athlete's androgen level is within the male range, unquote, plus if there was evidence of hormone receptors. So the idea was if we found that you had high androgen levels and we think you have receptors for them, then that would be a problem. At that point, you could be declared ineligible until you complied. And what compliance basically meant was that you had to agree to undergo various kinds of hormonal and sometimes surgical interventions to get your hormone level lower. And the policy said you could play as a male if you were eligible, but it didn't explain how the heck that would happen. The fact is that wouldn't work. Because in order to be in the male playing system, you would have had to come up through the ranks of the male playing system. It's not like, okay, you failed on the female side, so your team is just going to put you on the male side. That's not how eligibility works. And so it was a strange kind of comment to have in there, but the idea was, oh, we're not throwing you out, we're just saying you have to play as a male. So it was very, very problematic. What happened in 2015 is that another very brave intersex athlete stepped forward, and this was Judy Chan, a sprinter from India, who challenged this policy. She was told she had failed this policy and wouldn't be able to play. And she challenged it. She challenged it at the International Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is known as the CAS. So it's the court that decides how the sporting rules are going to work. And her testimony is extraordinarily moving. I reread it preparing for the talk today, and I was just struck by how she nails it. She basically said, when you go in here and you decide, you're saying that I'm not eligible as a female, you're basically saying I'm not a woman. And this upset the IOC greatly, because the IOC keeps saying, we're not saying that. We're not saying you're not a woman. We're just saying you can't play as a female. But socially and culturally, the truth is, if you say to a woman, you can't play as a female because you have male level hormones, the people around you typically read that as you're really male. And she was very legitimately concerned about going back to India, going back to her village where she had been hailed as a hero because she was an elite athlete, and being read as somebody who was a fake, somebody who was really a man, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what part of her, I mean, I'd love to read you pages and pages of her testimony, but I can only accept a little bit of it. This is one of the things she told the court. I am unable to understand why I am asked to fix my body in a certain way simply for participation as a woman. I was born a woman, reared up as a woman, I identify as a woman, and I believe I should be allowed to compete with other women, many of whom are either taller than me or come from more privileged backgrounds, things that most certainly give them an edge over me. And she's right. Where you grow up gives you a tremendous edge or a tremendous disadvantage. Things like height matter a lot. Issues of the way you process oxygen matter. The way that your muscles grow matter. And there's genetic differences all over the place that give some people advantages and some people disadvantages. And so she's saying, I was identified as a girl, I grew up as a woman, why are you telling me that I can't take advantage of any possible natural advantage that I have? So she pointed out, among other things, that, for example, men athletes are not subject to testosterone limits, which is true. A man can have a testosterone limit off the charts if he has it naturally. And nobody says you have too much. They only do that to women. She pointed out that the policy created stigma and danger, which is absolutely true based on the history of what's happened to women caught in these policies. She said that the concept of a level playing field is an illusory and meaningless concept because, in fact, people have all sorts of natural advantages, but also social advantages that come into play. And she said, I hope I am allowed to continue to do so without feeling coerced to undergo medical intervention for participation as a woman. And when I was consulting with the IOC, one of the things that they said convinced them that the testosterone levels matter is because when there were women caught in this policy and they agreed to undergo the procedures that basically lowered their estrogen level dramatically. So these are women with various intersex conditions who were told, if you want to keep playing, you're going to have to, in many cases, have a gonadectomy, have your gonads out. And in other cases, use chemical, basically kind of like a chemical castration to reduce your testosterone level. After they did that, their performance dropped, and they basically couldn't compete anymore. So the IOC saw this as evidence that testosterone matters. I also see it as evidence that testosterone matters, but I also see it as a losing game for these women, right? So basically, they're told if you want to keep playing, you have to get these major medical interventions. Then they get them, and then they still can't play because basically that was part of the advantage of how they got to where they are in the first place. So it's very upsetting to a lot of these women to be caught in the system. And so the system is still in flux because basically what happened is the court went back to the IOC and they said, we're suspending your regulations until we can figure this out better. So they said the hyperandrogen regulations would not be in place until they could figure it out. What was interesting was the court basically agreed with the basic idea that hormones matter and that hormone limits should matter, but they wanted more evidence that androgens matter. They wanted more scientific evidence. So they wanted the IOC and the IAAF to collect more evidence to prove that androgen levels matter enough. What is very interesting in the testimony, and was largely ignored in media reports of this, is that a lot of the scientists testifying admitted that it's not testosterone directly that matters, it's what it does to body mass. And it leads to a higher level lean body mass. And that's really what matters. But the problem is there's not an easy way to measure that. And so they're getting at it indirectly through going through the hormone system and looking at hormone levels. And they think hormone levels are easy to measure. Hormone levels are actually not that easy to measure because, as it turns out, testosterone levels fluctuate dramatically through the day. They differ with whether or not you're in a competition mode versus an exercise mode. They differ with regard to jet lag. So one of the challenges they've run into with testing athletes for testosterone levels, not just for this, but also for doping, is that they have to figure out whether or not there's all these different effects going on in terms of whether or not their bodies are reacting to the environment. But one of the people working with the IOC and IAAF is Joanna Harper, who is a transgender athlete herself. not at the Olympic level, but she's been collecting evidence with regard to what happens specifically to women who transition from male to female. And what she does find, in fact, is that when women transition in terms of track and field, their performance does fall. And there are a lot of, I'm a feminist, but there are a lot of feminist science studies people like myself who deny that testosterone matters. I think the evidence is overwhelming that it does matter, but that it's incredibly complicated and it's very difficult to understand a lot of it. And in practice, it can be very difficult to measure. So right now, the IAAF and IOC is suggesting limits because of new evidence on track and field, but only within the 400 meter to the 1 mile class, because that's where they can prove that it looks like it matters. So we're about to enter a very bizarre period, it looks like, of IOC history, where basically they're going to decide there's a particular way to understand femaleness, but only from 400 meters to 1 mile. It's going to be really strange, but they're trying desperately to be evidence-based, and they're trying to be fair, and that's where the evidence is leading them. So just to kind of bring this home, I want to tell you that there are 3 basic approaches going on here. And one approach is this approach that is, I would call basically a phobic approach, and that's the old approach that was used. It was an approach that basically was afraid of any kind of sex or gender difference. And what typically happened to women in that system who got caught in those was simple elimination, often through humiliation. Fortunately, we don't see as much of that anymore, and certainly not at the IOC level, so that's great. Where we're seeing them go instead is a biocentric model. And that's a model where basically there's believing still that biology is what matters more than gender upbringing, more than gender identification. Those things matter. You have to at least identify as a woman to compete as a woman, but they still want to very much focus on the biology of it. And then there's a third approach, which has not reached the elite level, but is emerging at lower levels, and that's what I would call a justice-centric model. And this is the model put forth by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, a policy called Sport in Transition. I'll talk a little more about that. And that's one I also consulted on. That's one that basically tries to think about sport being for something else. The sport isn't about figuring out who's the strongest. The sport is actually a social good, and we should think about what we do in sport as mattering socially throughout the ranks. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But let's first think about the biocentric model and what's going on with this policy for the IOC and IAAF. So this is another picture of Pastor Semenya. So this policy, as it exists and as it looks like it's going to continue to exist from 400 meters to 1 mile, requires that women have a relatively low level of what they call effective androgens. In other words, not just how much you make, but does your body hear it. And women are required to comply in order to compete. So the good news is they're finally starting to line up the policy on transgender women with the policy on women who are intersex, hyperandrogenized. In the past, they really didn't align these, and now they're starting to use the same numbers. For example, they're saying in both cases what we care about is one serum level of testosterone, and they're using the same numbers. The other good thing about this policy is it's trying hard to respect privacy. It's not always possible in the way that it gets carried out, but it's trying. It also tries to insist that this is not about questioning women's identity. So if you see the IAF or the IOC representatives talking about this, they will tell you all the time, we're not questioning these women's identities. We're just questioning whether or not they have an unfair biological advantage. So that's a step forward. I think it's double speak, but it's a step forward in terms of attitudinal change, and it's very positive. So what are the problems? Well, there are actually a lot of problems. For one thing, the application of this policy is relatively random in practice, in application. And the reason is it relies on somebody being ratted out and reported. And what we find historically as this policy is implemented is that it's very disproportionately applied to women from developing countries. Women in developed countries very rarely get subject to this policy. So it is in fact being subject to them much more. Why is that? Well, that's in part because women in industrialized nations are more likely to be caught early and identified because of advanced medical care systems as being intersex. And they're more likely to have already been subject to sex normalization before they get to that. So that's part of what's going on, but I think it's also going on because, frankly, women from industrialized nations have ways to slip the systems better in terms of their ability to get past this stuff and not be recorded. Secondly, it still marks women as sexually abnormal who get caught in the system. It's still marking them as being inappropriate women, as at some level not being allowed. I mean, it says you cannot compete as a woman unless you subject yourself to medical interventions. It also is, I believe, medically coercive because it says you can't compete, you can't go on with the life that you've been building for yourself unless you accept medical interventions. The other problem is we can't effectively measure effective androgens. So it's kind of, I know when I see it. I mean, you'd be surprised, but we actually don't have terrific ways to be able to say, okay, this is the level we're sure, and this is the level of receptors we're sure. In fact, what they do is look at things like they look at genital tissue and see whether or not there's particular hair growth patterns to try to figure out whether or not there's androgen reception. That's a kind of rough way to be doing something that we would prefer to be more rigorous, more scientific. The policy also denies women an inborn advantage, but it denies only some women an inborn advantage. So there are women who have other inborn advantages and men who have inborn advantages. So there are some men who naturally make very high levels of testosterone. Nobody says that's unfair if you're a man. There are men and women who have advantages in terms of their oxygen processing, their muscle tone, their all sorts of things, their height, their weight. They have advantages in other ways. So this really picks off one particular thing and says that's an unfair natural advantage. In fact, it seems to be the only thing that counts as an unfair natural advantage. And it's funny because unfair advantage normally is the opposite of natural advantage, but in this case, it's a natural advantage seen as unfair natural advantage. So it's very strange in that way, and I think it still tends to hold on to a particular idea of who counts as an appropriate woman. It also ignores various forms of hormonal game playing. This was a revelation to me. So when I was at the IOC, one of the other people that was consulting there was a woman who's an elite marathoner. And she ended up talking about the ways that women in sports use hormonal birth control manipulation to make sure that their menstrual cycles are matching to when they have to compete. And she started talking about this very elaborately in terms of the timing that they would do to make sure that their hormone levels were maximized in terms of their competition level. And I was stunned because this is totally legal in the system. So you can totally take female hormones and manipulate your system in order to make sure that you're maximizing the advantage of your hormone system using exogenous, using external hormones. You're allowed to do that, but you're not allowed to do that with testosterone, and you're not allowed to have the natural inborn advantage if you make a lot of testosterone, but you're allowed to do manipulation of estrogen as much as you want. The other thing is, there's an organization called WADA, which is the World Anti-Doping Association. And one of the big things WADA polices is testosterone doping. So there's a belief that if you take extra testosterone, you're going to perform better in some sports. And I think the evidence for that is strong. It's quite good that that's true. Not good that it's true. It's true. That I think that that is correct. That exogenous testosterone can boost your level. Well, there are all sorts of conditions for which you can get permission from WADA to take extra testosterone. This is called a therapeutic use exemption. So, for example, if you go to WADA and you show them that you have an intersex condition as a man that lowers your testosterone level naturally, they'll let you take extra testosterone legally as a man. So a man who is intersex is not considered to have an, I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around how this works, right? So a man with a naturally low level of testosterone is allowed to boost his testosterone level according to the rules. But a woman with a naturally high level is not allowed to have it. So they really do have this attitude that men own testosterone and that it is their hormone and they're allowed to have more of it if they want, but women are not allowed to have more of it. You can also get a therapeutic use exemption if you transition from female to male, which of course you need to do for transition purposes, but it's interesting that that's allowable. This hyperandrogenism policy also assumes that androgens are the key, when again, it looks like they're all talking about the fact that maybe lean body mass is what really matters. And I would say there's no one thing that really matters, because if there were one thing that mattered, we would know it by now. In fact, biology is complicated, sex is complicated, and nature and nurture are not separated from each other. They are intertwined. So all these kinds of things matter. So we'll see what happens going forward, but I think Judy Chan's case is going to be very interesting in terms of challenging the idea that this policy is somehow fair and just, because she's pointed out the ways in which it's kind of strange. So that's the biocentric policy that focuses on hormone levels. So what about finally the justice-centric approach? I'm not sure this could work at the elite level because it doesn't capture the way people think about sport, but it's a system I really like for as much sports as possible. And this is an approach that takes a very simple approach to womanhood. It says, whomever says she's a woman plays a woman. Does that mean we're going to get, as the AOC had told me they fear, Chinese and Russian people who take boys and say that they're girls in order to get them to win? That could certainly happen, but historically speaking, it hasn't happened. People have not transitioned for the purposes of cheating. It just doesn't happen. It does not look like people cross-identify gender for this purpose. And so there are actually a lot of sports now, a growing number of sports, that actually say that are women's sports that use the rule, the way we decide who plays as a woman is you sign a piece of paper saying, I'm a woman, I'm going to play as a woman, and that's it. And we don't ask any questions beyond that. And that, again, doesn't capture our instinct at the elite level, but at least at the non-elite level, it seems to capture the concept of inclusion and the concept of self-identification. And the model that the Canadian system is going off of politically is the model of integration that is racial integration in sports, where we heard over and over again historically that it would not be okay for people of color to play with white people. And yet, ultimately, sports led in many ways in terms of integration of society and was able to show the way forward. And so the notion here is that this could be a place where, again, sports could lead in terms of social progressiveness, in terms of leading people forward. So finally, I just want to encourage you to recognize the way that this problem is like other problems in sports. The typical way of approaching the question of intersex and transgender in sports is to say, oh, it's so different from everything else. That's actually pretty similar to other problems in sports. So it's one of those places where it may look like we're making a natural divide, but it's really a decision about what we're doing. So for example, it may look like we naturally divide people into younger and older, but we're making decisions about where to cut those things off. It's one of those places where we have to decide what's going to matter most to the sport. So we can say fairness, but what does fairness look like in practice? And historically speaking, dealing with that problem in sports is actually really difficult. And we have to come to decisions, and we do that through consensus. There's not a natural decision about what counts as sport. And then finally, there is issues of justice. Again, we haven't done the question. And it's one reason I so love seeing this picture of Tiffany Abreu in the New York Times, is because this is a picture of her with a fan who said to her, you know, you are my role model. And that's the kind of thing you can see when we see people who are comfortably out about being trans or being intersex in terms of sport, is it widens the ability to be mentors. It widens the ability to be role models for other people in terms of their lives. And that's not just about mentoring people in sports, that's mentoring people in their whole life. The IOC and the IAAF have not done a good enough job recognizing that every time they make a decision about intersex, and they say who counts as a woman and who doesn't count as a woman, what they're doing is telling thousands, tens of thousands of families across the world who have intersex daughters that their daughters are not really okay, that they have to be medically manipulated in order to really count as girls. And they need to recognize that the decisions made at that level don't just affect the athletes, they affect everybody who's dealing with any of this. And that's all of us, because all around us, even if we ourselves are not intersex or transgender, all around us are people who have these variations of sex and gender. And we have to think about that level of inclusiveness. So thank you.
Okay, so there you go.
Thank you. Early in your talk, you talked about in the IOC with the female transitioning to male. Do they have a level of testosterone that they're limited to, or when they transition the other way, you know, that way, is that a factor?
They do medical monitoring, but as you saw, the policy doesn't specifically state black and white what the level has to be. It appears that it doesn't matter. It's really interesting. You wouldn't want to hyperdose yourself on testosterone because it actually would cause a lot of medical problems and also feel really awful if you go too high a level with doping. But it is an interesting question of why we think, well, that one doesn't matter. So the way that WADA views testosterone on the female versus the male side is radically different, even though supposedly it's the same drug and it's supposed to be understood the same way in terms of treatment.
Hi, I just was wondering if you had any thoughts of the best way to be inclusive of people who identify as gender queer or gender fluid.
That's the next big step, right, for the question of where this stuff is going to go, because that's something the IOC and the IAAF has not yet dealt with. You know, I don't actually come from a sports background at all. In fact, I never played organized sports, and I now do little bits of triathlon, but I do it for my own sake. I don't do it competitively at all. So as I'm coming into this, I felt kind of naive, because I kept saying to people, it's supposed to be a game, right? Why are we this worried about who gets to play, who doesn't get to play? And that's going to be, I think, the next question is, where do we let people who don't identify in bifurcated systems play? And I don't know where that's going to go, but I think that's going to be a very interesting place. What we might see is more opportunities for people to cross into male games or female games without identifying as that gender. So there are already a lot of women who want to compete in male games without identifying as men. They want to compete as women in male sports because they like the level of play. And I've heard from a number of women who say, I really want it opened up because I want to be able to compete with those groups, but I'm not a man. I totally identify as a woman, I'm female typical, but I want to compete at that level. It does matter who you compete with. So for years, women have had men pacers in races, and those numbers have not been allowed to count because they say when you have a male pacer, women run faster. But it's interesting that women run faster with a male pacer, right? And it does suggest to us that women might play differently if they're playing with men. And men might play, we know, men play differently when they play with women. So what we may see is a loosening over time, although I doubt that that will happen at the elite level. I think it will first really happen at the level of play and then begin to see upward. And we'll see. We don't even have that right in baseball, really. We have very few women who play in professional baseball. And it's kind of funny because they could. Some women really could. For a long time, the Olympics didn't want to allow women to do ski jumping. And the claim was because they might hurt their uteruses. Which is the funniest claim because sports is brutal on your body no matter who you are, and no matter what you've got. Sports at that level can be brutal. What women speculated, and I think it's probably true, women have an advantage to some degree biologically in ski jumping. And so the idea was, well, if women competed, they might actually beat them. Now they're finally allowed to compete. So the policing of women has been very intense. And as we break out of that, I think we'll break into the system where we get to see more opportunities for people who are genderqueer, who don't identify as binary. And that's clearly here, right? We are at that point, at least in America, we are at that point in the system where we have folks who identify in that way. And if you want to play, there should be a place for you. You're going to get to run around, Michelle.
My only exercise is okay.
Yes, you didn't wear your running shoes.
So that just made me think that if you could have the opposite happening with men who are not good enough perhaps to play in the men's group saying, well, I want to play as a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, if you're following your logic, you would say, that's fine. And in terms of social justice, it sounds lovely. Let's just let everybody play now and stop. But then we're back to the point you made at the very beginning,
Right.
where if we don't have these groups, in fact, most people end up not getting to play at all.
And that is a problem. That is absolutely a problem. And we want to maintain a system whereby, and that will disadvantage women mostly.
Right.
And we want to have a system where women get to play. So how do we get through that? It's very difficult to think through. I mean, it is hard to think through, right? I think we definitely want to maintain ways for women to make sure that they have their own sports. And since I started working in this area, to me it's really interesting too when I go to women's games versus men's games to also experience the difference in the crowd. Because for example, if I go to college basketball, and I live in East Lansing, so Michigan State is a big university here. If I go to men's college basketball and then I go to women's college basketball, it's a totally different vibe. And frankly, I find it more enjoyable to take a child to a women's game because the people in the audience are kind of rooting for both teams. There's a different vibe. And I'm not going gonna say that's a biological difference, right? That's just a fact, that it's different. So what we lose if we were to say, let's make everybody play on level and not on gender, would not only be opportunities for women to play, it would be opportunities for fans that would change. It would change the readability for girls to see women playing and be strong at that level. So I think we don't want to give that up. So there's a question, how do we approach that? And I don't think that there's an easy answer to it.
Springfield, do you have any questions?
How do they talk to us? Do we feel their questions? Oh, cool. Telepathic.
So how much of this you feel is driven by the language or the social norms that we have today versus what we had 25 years ago? And is it possible that sport needs to develop a third rail where it's general neutral, where
I will say,
it's not really male, or anybody can compete? You can still have all men's sports, all women's sports, and then you could have this, I don't know how to, general neutral or general fluid.
yeah, it's hard to say, particularly when you get to international sports, because there are so many different cultures with so many different concepts of what's normal in terms of gender. So that becomes really challenging. So there are some traditional cultures that have more than two genders, for example. Then there are some cultures that are extremely gender phobic and very rigid. So it's really difficult to say at the international level who should be making the decision. I will say that when I went and consulted with the IOC and the IAAF, I was struck by how it really felt like there were men making decisions about women's sports, and it really bothered me. And I would like to see what would happen if you actually let women decide this issue and not let men decide this issue. I think you might get very different types of decisions. And the reason I say that is because as I got to talk to more and more elite women athletes, one of the things I heard from them over and over again is, we've all been gender suspect. We're strong women. We can kick the butts of most men, right? Because most elite women athletes can slaughter any man in the sport. I mean, in the sport that they compete in, they are really amazing athletes. So they have no trouble beating men. And so they have been subject to that sort of gender suspicion. Their whole, even if they're female typical and they've never had any question about their own gender identity, they're still subject socially to gender suspicion. So to me, it would be really interesting to get them together and let them decide what to do with these problems. Some of them are competitive enough that they would say, anybody I can eliminate, I'm going to eliminate, because I don't want anybody competing against me, right? But many of them tell me that they're very sympathetic to women who are found to be intersex and women who are transgender, because they themselves have been subject to this kind of social scrutiny and this athletic scrutiny, and that they may be more generous, frankly, and more thoughtful, I think, in terms of thinking about the ways that they're, for example, manipulating their own hormones in some cases. So to my mind, where we could use more gender division is actually in this decision, and we should give it to women and let women make the decision and take it out of the hands of the men who actually are mostly in control of this. It was very strange to me, in 2012, I think it was, to be in a room that was discussing the decision of who gets to be a woman, and it was almost entirely men. I was like, wow, how is this possible? That in 2012, I'm in a room making a decision about women's lives at the most critical level. These women live their whole lives aiming for this, and it's men making decisions. Yeah, it's not just that stuff, right? It's still the case that, for example, women are subject to being required to wear uniforms in some cases, which are totally outrageous and sexist and dehumanizing. For example, in volleyball, there's a lot of women who don't wear the uniforms that they're required to wear, which are basically skinny bikinis. So there's a lot of ways in which women's sports is still controlled by, frankly, profit, and in that case, often controlled by men. And sometimes when I give talks on this subject, people share their own experiences with regard to gender divisions in sports, so feel free. I was telling somebody earlier about a story a woman told me after a talk on the subject who had grown up with a soccer-obsessed father, and she happened to grow up in a small town in Texas where there was no girls' soccer. This was years ago. And so her father got her on the boys' team, and she grew up playing boys' soccer. She was a girl, female typical, but she grew up playing boys soccer because there was no girls soccer and her father wanted her to play soccer. And she loved soccer. She loved it. When she ended up going to college, she played on the women's team, and she couldn't do it because she had been taught a totally different style of play. And she said she couldn't even put her finger on what the difference was, but she knew she was gender inappropriate. There was some way in which the girls gave her the clear message, you don't play like we play. It's not okay. And she ended up dropping out of soccer because she had been raised to play boys soccer, not to play girls soccer. And they found that really interesting in terms of the different norms within sports. And we certainly do see that, the ways that girls are taught different types of play. So in more and more countries like Canada, for kids, particularly pre-pubertal, there's not gender divisions in a lot of sports. Boys and girls play together, and then they begin to be divided starting at puberty. And it is interesting to think about what it would be if we recognize that boys and girls pre-pubertal really probably don't need to be divided in terms of most things. And even at puberty, there might be a question whether or not we should divide people according to skill level for a while rather than gender. Could we have teenagers, for example, play according to skill level rather than gender? And that would be an interesting way to do it.
It strikes me too that there's another reason that a gender divide occurs around puberty, and that's with respect to contact sports. So I love sports, and I grew up with sports, and I recall in our high school we had a boys water polo team, but only one woman who was interested, so she played on the boys team, and then the other teams complained that she played unfairly under the water and would grab them and it hurt really bad. And so the men were complaining that she was really very good at what she did, but and she was terrific. But I myself played in sports that were divided in sports that weren't. Karate as a kid or as an adult. We were always put together, and there really wasn't a whole lot of difference in terms of skill level. But then when we compete, they force us to be different. And it struck me, I've had an interest even in scholarship and in gladiator sports and contact sports, that if it seems to be something like wrestling or something that could be sexualized in some way, they make this sexual orientation assumption that men and women should not be together, which opens up a whole other can of worms, right, in terms of what that is and should that even matter and how people feel about that. But then you get something like karate where you're hitting each other and you're maybe a foot away from each other, and that's okay.
Yeah. Clearly, nobody should be subject to sexual harassment in sport, but dividing people by gender doesn't stop that, right? People are subject to sexual harassment within gender-divided sports frequently, and are subject to sexual assault, as we know, too. So clearly, gender division doesn't somehow solve the sex problem in sport. Maybe gender mixing would make us more aware of it, potentially, but I'm not sure that it would. We certainly are hearing a lot more finally from boys who've been sexually abused by their coaches than we've ever heard before, because they're finally at the point where they can talk about that. And it's kind of shocking to realize the level to which the heterosexual assumption that if you put boys with men, there will be no sex, has turned out to be a dangerous assumption in terms of sexual abuse.
Okay. You mentioned just briefly that some of these organizations are responsive to research and that research is needed in different areas. I know that this is kind of an interdisciplinary crowd, psychologists, people in law and medicine. And so I was wondering if you could talk just briefly about the frontiers of research in this arena and where contributions could be made to forward this conversation.
Right now, the elite sports bodies are only really interested in biology. So they're only interested really in the question of, well, especially testosterone, they're very obsessed with that question in sports performance. But I do think it would be valuable to think more in terms of the sociology and the psychology. And there are people who do this in sports studies, and thinking about the ways that, for example, gendered assumptions come into play when people are in particular sports. So that could be really interesting. Gender is incredibly difficult to study. It is probably one of the hardest things to study. And part of the reason is that we've assumed it's bifurcated and that it's stable. And we know, in fact, that it's not bifurcated and also that it's not stable. So, and sex is not stable either. People don't stop sexually developing at puberty. They keep sexually developing. So menopause, for example, is part of natural sexual development. People continue to respond biologically to social cues. So, for example, I'll just give you one that has nothing to do with sports. If you take older women and you give them a new sex partner, their sexual interest goes up. Now, that may not sound surprising. That may be a nomination for the dog award, right? But it's very interesting that the assumption over time has been that women naturally become frigid as they get older, when in fact the studies show pretty clearly they don't become frigid, they become bored. And that's very different. And if you introduce novel sex partners that they like, that in fact their sexual interest and their hormones respond. Their brains respond, their bodies respond. And so the assumption has been that somehow sex kind of stops at puberty. What we know is that sex keeps going and that it's reactive to what's going on culturally and socially and psychologically. And gender is actually not that different. So gender continues to morph for people as they go through their lives. And what I mean by that is, for example, there's a lot of good reason to believe that, for example, women, as they are reaching their 50s and their 60s, and I'm thinking about this because I'm at this age, but as we reach our 50s and our 60s, that we enter a kind of different understanding of gender. That, for example, a lot of women become more politically conscious of the ways in which they've been subject to sexual harassment and sexism. And I think my own experience is part of the reason that probably happens is because men become less interested in you. You suddenly become aware of how you didn't realize you were responding to male cues all the time because you were just taught to do it, or you just did it naturally. I don't know where we were taught, or we just do it. But as that fades, you become aware of the level to which you've been organizing your life to male response. And that's probably much more true for straight women than for women who are not straight, but as you do that and you come out of that, you begin to come out of this fog, and we know that political activism starts to go up as women in their 50s and 60s. We've assumed that that's because their children are raised and they have time for it, and that they have work to do with it. But then they also have to do with the way our biology is now interacted psychologically. So gender and sex are really difficult to study, and there's not a simple bifurcation. And as a consequence, studying gender is really, really difficult. And when people ask me, what should I do if I want to study gender, I always say, I don't even know where to start, because it's like a constant moving target in people's lives. You can give people gender tests, but we don't even know if they're answering in ways that are meaningful because of the degree to which people are sensitive to the assumptions around them. It can be very difficult to know what is your belief and what is the social belief that's demanded to you, whether there's a difference. It's really, really hard to know.
I mean, how big a problem do you think it would be if the IOC adopted the Canadian plan? What impact in terms of numbers do we know, percentages of athletes would be eligible to compete under the Canadian rule that would, the IOC rule would knock out a competition? Are we talking about large numbers or is it fairly small?
We have no idea. And the reason we have no idea is that the number of people who identify as a gender other than the one assigned to them differs dramatically by culture and by moment. And so we know, for example, in the United States, the number is going way, way up now. But we don't know if that number will go back down or if that number will stabilize. We don't know if that number is reflective of biological differences or if it's cultural and social concepts. And so we don't really know what would happen. And what the IOC would tell you is that they're afraid that there are nations that basically just take advantage of this. And we just take men and have them identify as women and have them play. They may be right. They may be right because we know, historically speaking, that there have in fact been cases of people trying to sneak men through under women's sports. But there have been very, 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 very few of them, as far as we can tell. Some of those people seem to have actually been intersex athletes. So we really don't know. What we know is that there's always a fear of cheating around gender, but it doesn't seem to materialize, but it might in the future if we're allowed. So I think the answer is we simply don't know what would happen. In some ways, we're already kind of there because the hyperandrogenism rules have been suspended. So because of the Yu Chan case. So at the moment, you actually could kind of be cheating, quote unquote, and there would be no system for kicking you out, because right now the rules are suspended. But it doesn't look like there are people cheating in terms of men who are playing as women, males who are playing as women without identifying truly as women. So we don't know. But the fear is that this would create a sort of problem among what they consider to be the cheating nations. China always gets named, Russia gets named when they get into the conversations. China is the new Russia.